The candle in Alara Voss's hand shook so badly that hot wax dripped onto her fingers, but she did not feel the burn. She had just heard something no maid was ever supposed to hear, and now every step she took through the cold stone corridor felt like it might be her last. Behind the war room door, two voices had been speaking in low, careful tones, and one of them belonged to a man the entire kingdom trusted with their lives. She pressed herself against the wall as a guard passed, his armor clinking softly in the dark. Her heart pounded so loud she was certain he could hear it. When he turned the corner and disappeared, she finally allowed herself to breathe. But the relief did not last. What she had heard was too dangerous to carry alone, and too dangerous to ignore. 3 years she had polished floors and folded linens in Castle Blackthorn, moving through hallways like a shadow nobody noticed. Servants were meant to be invisible, and Alara had mastered that art without even trying. People spoke freely around her, forgetting she was there, and tonight that habit had shown her a truth that could burn the kingdom to the ground. King Damian Cross ruled Blackthorn as its alpha, a title that meant strength, cunning, and absolute command over every wolf in his territory. Men feared him. Enemies avoided his lands, and the one person he trusted above all others, Commander Julian Ashford, his beta and closest advisor, had just spoken words that made Alara's blood turn to ice. She had only caught fragments, a shipment arriving before midnight, a distraction planned inside the castle walls. A voice that was not Julian's, low and unfamiliar, warning him to be careful, because tonight was the only chance they would get. And then, worst of all, Julian's own voice, calm and steady, promising that the king would suspect nothing until it was too late. Alara did not know the full plan. She did not know who Julian was working with, or what exactly would happen when night fell completely. All she knew was that the man closest to the king, the one who stood beside him at every council meeting, the one who trained beside him in the yard and dined at his table, was planning something against him, and it was happening tonight. She should have run to her small room and pretended she heard nothing. That would have been the safe choice, the choice that kept her alive and unnoticed for another day. But Alara had grown up in a small village near the eastern border, a place the Alpha King's laws had protected from raiders for years. Her family owed their safety to the crown, and something inside her refused to let that crown fall without a warning. The problem was reaching him. Kings did not simply speak with maids. There were steps, walls, layers of guards and stewards standing between someone like her and someone like him. She hurried toward the servants' stairwell, her mind racing through every possible way to get a message to the one person who needed to hear it. The head steward, a stern woman named Margaret Hale, was still awake in the kitchen corridor when Alara found her, breathless and pale. Margaret took one look at her and frowned, setting down the ledger she had been reviewing. "You look like you have seen a ghost, girl," Margaret said, her voice sharp but not unkind. Alara struggled to steady her breathing. "I need to speak with the king. Tonight. It cannot wait until morning." Margaret's frown deepened into something closer to alarm, though not the kind Alara had hoped for. She laughed, a short, disbelieving sound, and shook her head. "The king does not receive maids in the middle of the night over nothing. Whatever foolish notion has gotten into your head, put it aside and go to bed." "This is not foolish," Alara insisted, stepping closer. "I overheard something in the war room, something about Commander Ashford. Please, Margaret, someone needs to warn him before it is too late." The mention of Julian Ashford's name only made Margaret more dismissive. "The commander is the most loyal man in this castle," she said firmly. "He has served the king since they were boys. Whatever you think you heard, you misunderstood it. Now go, before I report you for spreading rumors that could get you thrown in the dungeon." Alara wanted to argue further, but she saw in Margaret's eyes that nothing she said would change the older woman's mind. She turned and walked away, her thoughts spinning. If Margaret would not help her reach the king, she would have to find another way, even if it meant breaking every rule she had ever followed as a servant. She made her way toward the private wing of the castle, where the king's chambers stood behind two heavy oak doors guarded day and night. The hallway leading there was usually forbidden to maids after sunset, but Alara pressed forward anyway, her candle flickering with each hurried step. She had to try. If she was wrong, she would face punishment, but if she was right and said nothing, the consequences could be far worse for everyone she cared about. The guards outside the king's chambers straightened as she approached, their expressions hardening into suspicion the moment they recognized she did not belong there. One of them, A broad-shouldered man with a scar across his jaw stepped forward and raised a hand. "This corridor is closed to servants at this hour," he said. "Turn back now." "I need to speak with the king," Ilara said, forcing her voice to stay steady despite the fear coursing through her. "It concerns his safety." The guard's eyes narrowed. "Every servant who wishes to bother His Majesty claims urgency. Go back to your quarters before I have you removed by force." Ilara's mind raced. She had no proof, no rank, nothing but words that sounded like madness to anyone who had not heard them firsthand. But she could not walk away now. She thought of her family, of the peaceful village that depended on the king's protection, and she planted her feet firmly in place. "Please," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I would not risk my position over nothing. Something terrible may happen tonight, and I believe His Majesty needs to know before it is too late." The second guard, younger and less certain than his companion, glanced toward the chamber doors as if debating whether the commotion might already be drawing attention. Before either man could decide what to do with her, the heavy oak door creaked open from within. King Damian Cross stepped into the corridor himself, having clearly heard the exchange through the thick wood. He was not dressed for court, wearing only a simple dark tunic, his golden eyes sharp and alert despite the late hour. He was younger than most people imagined before meeting him, with an intensity in his gaze that made even seasoned warriors uneasy. He looked first at his guards, then at the trembling maid standing before them. "What is the meaning of this disturbance?" he asked, his voice low and controlled, carrying an authority that needed no volume to command the room. The scarred guard straightened immediately. "Forgive us, Your Majesty. This maid insists on speaking with you. We were sending her away." Damian's gaze shifted fully onto Ilara, studying her the way a predator studies something unexpected crossing its path. She felt suddenly very small under that attention, and every carefully rehearsed word she had planned to say vanished from her mind. But she could not afford to stay silent now, not when she had come this far. "Your beta will betray you tonight," she blurted out, the words tumbling from her lips before fear could stop them completely. Silence fell over the corridor like a physical weight. The guards froze, clearly expecting the king to erupt in fury, or order her immediate arrest for such an outrageous accusation against his most trusted commander. Ilara herself braced for the worst, certain she had just sealed her fate with those reckless words. But Damian did not shout. He did not summon the dungeon guards. Instead, something flickered across his sharp features that no one in that corridor expected. Not the guards, not Ilara, and certainly not anyone who knew the king's reputation for swift and merciless judgment against those who dared to accuse his closest allies without proof. A low, quiet laugh escaped him, dangerous and knowing, the kind of sound that made both guards exchange uneasy glances. It was not the laugh of a man dismissing a foolish claim. It was the laugh of someone who had been waiting, perhaps for weeks, for a piece of information to finally surface. "Bring her inside," Damian said, turning back toward his chamber door. The scarred guard hesitated. "Your Majesty, surely you do not intend to entertain such a claim from a servant without proper questioning by the guard captain first." Damian paused at the threshold and looked back, his golden eyes gleaming with something between amusement and cold calculation. "I intend to hear exactly what she has to say, myself, and without an audience of half the castle listening at the door. Bring her in, and see that no one else learns of this conversation until I say otherwise." The guards exchanged another glance but did not argue further. One of them gestured for Ilara to follow, and she stepped forward on legs that felt unsteady beneath her, following the King of Blackthorn into his private chamber, uncertain whether she had just saved herself or walked directly into far greater danger than the one she had come to warn him about. The room beyond the door was simpler than she expected for a king, lit by a single fire in the hearth and a scattering of candles across a heavy wooden desk covered in maps and papers. Damian closed the door firmly behind them, sealing away the guards and any chance of eavesdropping servants, and turned to face her fully for the first time. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward a chair near the fire, though his tone made it clear this was not truly an invitation, but an instruction. Ilara sat carefully, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. She watched as the king poured himself a small measure of dark liquid from a decanter on his desk, though he did not drink it immediately. Instead, he turned back to her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "Tell me your name," he said. "Ilara Voss, Your Majesty," she answered. "And where did you hear this claim about my beta, Elara Voss?" he asked, each word measured and precise, as though he were already weighing every possible angle of what she might say next. She swallowed hard. "In the war room," she said. "I was cleaning near the eastern wall, behind the tapestry, and I did not mean to overhear anything. But two voices were speaking, and one was Commander Ashford's. They spoke of a shipment arriving before midnight, and a distraction planned somewhere within the castle. Another voice, one I did not recognize, told him tonight was the only chance they would have. The commander said you would suspect nothing until it was too late." Damien's expression did not change, but something in his golden eyes sharpened further, like a blade being drawn slowly from its sheath. He set down the decanter without drinking from it and moved closer, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself to hold his gaze. "Did you recognize the second voice at all?" he asked. "Anything about it? An accent? A particular way of speaking?" Elara thought back carefully, trying to recall every detail through the fog of her fear. "It was not a voice from the castle," she said slowly. "It carried an accent I have heard before, from traders who come from the northern forests, cold and clipped, the way people speak near the Thornwood border." For the first time since she had spoken her warning, Damien's calm mask cracked slightly, replaced by something darker and far more focused. He turned away from her and walked toward the window, staring out into the night as though searching for something beyond the castle walls that only he could see. "The Thornwood pack," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Elara did not know what that meant, but she could see clearly that whatever suspicion Damien had been carrying, her words had just confirmed something he already feared, but had not yet proven. The fire crackled softly in the silence that followed, and outside, somewhere beyond the thick stone walls, the night continued to march steadily toward whatever midnight had planned. The king's fingers tightened around the edge of the window frame, until his knuckles turned pale, and for a moment, Elara feared she had said something that would cost her more than she ever intended. Thornwood was a name she had heard whispered in the servants' hall, always in tones of caution, always connected to old conflicts that predated her own arrival at the castle. She had not expected her stray words to strike so deep a nerve. Damien turned back to face her, and whatever storm had crossed his features moments before was gone, replaced by the same controlled calm he wore in public. Yet his eyes still burned with a sharper light than before, the look of a man who had just found the missing piece of a puzzle he had been assembling in silence for a long time. "You have done something very dangerous tonight," he said, walking slowly back toward her chair. "Not because you were wrong, Elara Voss, but because you were right." She did not know how to respond to that. Her instinct told her to apologize, to explain that she had never intended to involve herself in matters far beyond her station, but something about the way he studied her stopped the words in her throat. He did not look angry. He looked like a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about the people closest to him. "For weeks," Damien continued, his voice quieter now, almost as though he were speaking a private thought aloud rather than addressing her directly, "I have noticed small things. Missing reports, delayed messages, a guard rotation changed without my order. I dismissed each one as coincidence, because the alternative was unthinkable." Elara hesitated before speaking again, unsure whether it was her place to ask, but curiosity and fear pushed the question out of her anyway. "What alternative, Your Majesty?" "That someone inside these walls, someone I trust completely, has been working against me," he said, and this time, there was no mistaking the weight behind his words. "Julian Ashford has stood beside me since we were boys training in the same yard. He has fought at my side in 3 wars. If what you heard tonight is true, then everything I believed about loyalty in this castle has been built on sand." The fire popped softly in the hearth, filling the silence that followed. Elara watched the king pace slowly across the room, his mind clearly working through possibilities she could not begin to imagine. She had come here only to deliver a warning, expecting perhaps to be dismissed or punished for her boldness. She had never expected to become part of whatever came next. "I need you to tell me everything again," Damien said finally, stopping in front of her chair. "Every word, every detail, no matter how small it seems. Sometimes the smallest detail changes everything." Elara nodded and forced herself to slow down, replaying the memory carefully in her mind, rather than rushing through it, as fear had made her do earlier. She described the tapestry she had been cleaning behind, the 2 sets of footsteps she had heard entering the war room, and the low murmur of voices that had grown clearer as she pressed closer without meaning to eavesdrop at all. The unfamiliar voice spoke first, she said. He said something about a shipment crossing the eastern ridge before midnight, and that the castle would be distracted by the time it arrived. Commander Ashford asked if the ridge patrol had been handled, and the voice confirmed it had, that the patrol captain had been paid well enough to look elsewhere tonight. Damien's jaw tightened at the mention of a paid patrol captain, and Alara could see him mentally sorting through the names of every man responsible for guarding that stretch of border. She continued, recalling the next part of the conversation with growing clarity, now that the immediate panic had faded into focused memory. Then the commander said something about loyalty, she continued. He said he owed loyalty to someone greater than a king who inherited his throne, rather than earning it through strength alone. The other voice laughed at that, and said tonight would prove which king truly deserved to rule these lands. The words hung heavy in the room, and Damien's expression darkened further, though his composure remained remarkably steady, given what he was hearing. Alara realized she was witnessing something few people ever saw, a king forced to confront the deepest betrayal a leader could face, and somehow finding the discipline to think clearly, rather than react with blind fury. This confirms more than I wanted to know, Damien said quietly. There have long been whispers that Thornwood never accepted my father's treaty ending our conflict decades ago. Some among their ranks still believe Blackthorn's throne belongs to bloodlines older than mine. If Julian has aligned himself with them, this goes far beyond a simple betrayal of friendship. This threatens the entire kingdom's stability. Alara swallowed hard, feeling suddenly very aware of how far beyond her role as a maid this conversation had carried her. What will you do, Your Majesty? She asked carefully. Damien studied her for a long moment before answering, as though weighing not just his plan, but whether he could trust the woman sitting before him with what he was about to say. I cannot simply arrest Julian based on second-hand words overheard through a tapestry, he said. He commands loyalty among many of my guards. If I move against him without proof, and I am wrong, I fracture this castle from within before any outside threat even arrives. And if I am right, but act too soon, he will simply deny everything and wait for another chance. Then what proof would satisfy you? She asked. I need to see it happen myself, he said simply. Or someone I trust needs to witness it directly. Someone close enough to the situation to confirm without doubt what is truly unfolding tonight. Alara felt a cold weight settle in her stomach as she understood the direction of his thoughts, before he even spoke them aloud. You cannot mean for me to continue watching, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Damien's gaze met hers, steady and searching. I know what I am asking is dangerous, he said. You already risked everything by coming to me tonight, and I have no right to ask more of you, but you moved through this castle unnoticed for 3 years, invisible to those who would never suspect a maid of anything beyond her duties. That invisibility could be the only advantage I have right now. She wanted to refuse. Every instinct told her to return to her small room, lock the door, and pray that whatever happened tonight would happen without her further involvement. She had already done more than most servants would have dared, delivering a warning that could easily have ended in her arrest, rather than this strange, quiet conversation with the king himself. But then she thought of her village near the eastern border, the peace it had known under Blackthorn's protection, and the shipment the strange voice had mentioned crossing that very ridge before midnight. If Thornwood forces succeeded in whatever plan Julian had helped arrange, that peace could shatter, not just for the castle, but for every village depending on the kingdom's strength to keep them safe. What would you need me to do? She asked finally, her voice steadier than she felt inside. Damien's expression shifted slightly, something like respect flickering behind his golden eyes, though he did not smile. Continue your duties exactly as you always have, he said. Move through the halls as you normally would, drawing no attention to yourself. If you see Julian leave his post, or notice anything unusual near the servants' passages tonight, find a way to signal me without revealing that anything is wrong. I will position trusted men where they can watch without being seen. How will I signal you? She asked. There is a boy in the kitchens, Damien said after a moment's thought, young Peter, who delivers messages between the guard captains during drills. He is loyal to me alone, and few would think twice about a kitchen boy moving through the halls at night. Find him if you see anything, and tell him only that the linens need attention in the east wing. He will know what that means, and bring word to me immediately. Alara nodded slowly, memorizing the instruction, even as fear coiled tighter in her chest. "And if Commander Ashford discovers what I am doing?" she asked, unable to stop the question from slipping out. Damien's expression turned grave, and for a moment, the mask of controlled calm slipped just enough for her to see the genuine concern beneath it. "Then you must not let him discover it," he said quietly. "Stay in the shadows you have always known how to disappear into. That skill kept you unnoticed for 3 years. Let it protect you again tonight." She left his chamber a short while later, her mind spinning with the weight of what she had agreed to do. The corridor outside felt different now than it had when she first walked through it, every shadow seeming to hold new significance, every distant sound carrying new meaning. She was no longer simply a maid who had overheard something troubling. She was now a thread in a plan the king himself had woven, and if that thread snapped, the consequences would fall on far more than just herself. As she made her way back toward the servants' quarters, she passed the corridor leading to the beta's chambers, and her steps slowed involuntarily. Julian Ashford's door stood closed, no light visible beneath it, giving no indication of the betrayal Damien now believed was unfolding somewhere within those walls before midnight arrived. She forced herself to keep walking, her heart hammering against her ribs with every step, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything she thought she understood about the castle she called home. A sudden clatter of metal against stone made Alara freeze halfway down the servants' stairwell, her candle nearly slipping from her grip. She pressed herself against the cold wall, straining to listen, until she realized it was only a dropped tray somewhere in the kitchens below, followed by a muttered apology and quiet laughter. She let out a shaky breath and continued down the steps, reminding herself that every sound tonight would feel like a threat until this was over. The kitchens were mostly empty at this hour, the great ovens cooling from the evening meal, embers glowing faintly beneath iron grates. She found Peter exactly where Damien said he would be, curled on a bench near the fire, half asleep with a wooden practice sword resting across his knees. He startled awake when she touched his shoulder, blinking up at her with the wariness of a boy who had learned to be careful around anyone who woke him suddenly. "I need you to remember something important," she said quietly, kneeling beside the bench so her voice would not carry. "If I ever send word that the linens need attention in the East Wing, you must go straight to the king, no matter the hour, no matter who tries to stop you." Peter's sleepy expression sharpened immediately, and something in his young face told her he already understood this was no ordinary request about laundry. "Is something wrong?" he whispered. "Just remember what I told you," she said, unwilling to burden him with more than necessary. "Can I trust you to do this?" He nodded firmly, sitting up straighter on the bench, and Alara felt a small measure of relief, knowing at least one piece of the plan was secured. She left him there, watching her disappear back up the stairwell with wide, curious eyes, and made her way toward her own small room at the end of the servants' corridor. Sleep did not come easily that night, though she lay still on her narrow cot, staring at the shadows dancing across the low ceiling. Every creak of the old castle timbers made her sit up, certain it signaled something happening beyond her door. She thought of Julian Ashford's calm, steady voice she had heard through the tapestry, a voice she had trusted for 3 years whenever he passed her in the halls with a polite nod or a brief word of thanks for her work. It felt impossible to reconcile that familiar kindness with the betrayal Damien now feared. Eventually she rose, unable to bear the stillness any longer, and decided to begin her rounds earlier than usual, using the excuse of extra linens needing collection from the upper floors. If she was going to watch for anything unusual, she reasoned, she might as well be moving through the halls where she could actually see something, rather than lying awake imagining shadows. The upper corridors were quiet, lit only by scattered wall torches burning low. She moved with practiced silence, years of service having taught her exactly which floorboards creaked and which stayed still, which doors opened without a sound, and which needed careful handling. She passed the library, its heavy doors closed, and the small chapel where a single candle always burned through the night for those who wished to pray. Near the East Tower stairwell, she paused, noticing a faint light flickering beneath a door that should have been dark at this hour, the old records room where the castle kept its ledgers and correspondence. It was rarely used except during quarterly accounting, and certainly never in the middle of the night. Curiosity outweighed caution, and she crept closer, careful to keep her footsteps silent against the stone. Voices drifted faintly through the door, too muffled to make out clear words, but she recognized the cadence of Julian Ashford's speech immediately, calm and measured even now. A second voice responded, lower and rougher. and though Alara could not place it precisely, something about its accent matched the cold clip she had described to the king only hours earlier. Her pulse quickened as she considered her next move. She could try to get closer, risk discovery for the sake of clearer information, or she could retreat immediately and send word to Peter as instructed. Damien's warning about staying hidden echoed in her mind, and she forced herself to step back slowly from the door, rather than pressing her ear against the old wood, as every instinct urged her to do. As she turned to leave, her sleeve brushed against a small side table positioned along the wall, causing a decorative bowl to wobble dangerously close to the edge. She caught it just in time, her heart lodged somewhere in her throat, and steadied it silently, before hurrying away down the corridor, with far more speed than her usual measured pace allowed. She found Peter still awake near the kitchen fire, and delivered the coded message exactly as planned, watching him dart off toward the king's private study without hesitation. Relief washed over her only briefly, before new tension replaced it, knowing that whatever happened next was now entirely out of her hands. Within minutes, Damien himself appeared at the top of the servants' stairwell, moving with a controlled urgency that betrayed none of the danger simmering beneath his calm exterior. He found her waiting near the linen closet where she had agreed to remain, and his sharp eyes studied her face for any sign of what she had witnessed. "The records room," she whispered before he could ask. "Commander Ashford is inside with someone else." I could not make out their words clearly, but the second voice matched what I described to you earlier. Damien's expression hardened, though he kept his voice equally low. "How long ago?" "Only minutes," she said. I did not linger long enough to hear anything specific. He nodded once, processing the information with the same swift precision she had witnessed in his study earlier that night. "You did well," he said, and though the words were simple, something in his tone carried genuine gratitude that surprised her. "Stay here. Do not follow me further." But before he could move, footsteps echoed from further down the corridor, unhurried and confident, the distinct rhythm of boots belonging to someone accustomed to walking these halls with authority. Damien's expression shifted instantly, and he pulled Alara gently but firmly into the shadow of a deep alcove beside the linen closet, pressing a finger briefly to his lips. Through the narrow gap between the alcove's edge and the wall, Alara watched Julian Ashford emerge from the direction of the East Tower stairwell, his expression composed and unreadable, exactly as it always appeared during council meetings. He paused near the intersection of corridors, glancing briefly toward the servants' stairwell, before continuing on toward his own chambers, apparently unaware that anyone observed his movements. Damien remained motionless beside her, until Julian's footsteps faded completely into silence, and only then did he release the breath he had been holding. Alara realized her own hands were trembling, pressed flat against the cold stone wall, as though bracing herself against everything she had just witnessed. "He suspects nothing yet," Damien murmured, more to himself than to her. "That gives us time, but not much of it." "What do we do now?" Alara whispered. Damien turned to face her fully, and in the dim torchlight she saw calculation replacing the earlier tension in his expression, the mind of a strategist already assembling the pieces of whatever came next. "We wait for the shipment he mentioned to arrive," Damien said. "If Thornwood forces are truly moving toward the eastern ridge tonight, I need eyes confirming it before I act against Julian directly. Accusing him now, without undeniable proof, only warns our enemies that we know their plan." "But if we wait too long," Alara said, unable to hide the worry in her voice, "could something worse happen before you have the chance to stop it?" "That is the risk I must weigh carefully," Damien admitted, his jaw tightening. "I have men I trust stationed near the ridge already, quietly repositioned earlier this evening, under the pretense of routine patrol changes. If anything crosses that border tonight, I will know within the hour." Alara nodded slowly, though the uncertainty gnawed at her regardless. Everything about this night felt like walking along the edge of a blade, one misstep away from disaster in either direction, whether from acting too soon or waiting too long. She studied the king's face, searching for any sign of doubt, but found only steady resolve. "You should return to your quarters now," Damien said gently, though his tone left little room for argument. "You have already given me more than I could have asked. Let me handle what comes next." But something in Alara refused to simply walk away now, not when she had come this far already. "I want to help," she said firmly. "If there is anything more I can do, please let me." Damien studied her for a long moment, an unreadable expression crossing his sharp features, something between reluctance and reconsideration. Finally he spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "There may be one more thing," he said, "but it will be far more dangerous than anything you have done tonight so far." "Tell me," she said, meeting his gaze without flinching, surprising even herself with the steadiness of her own voice. Damien led her quietly into a small alcove further from the main corridor, where the shadows grew deeper, and any passing guard would need to look closely to notice them at all. He kept his voice low, each word measured as though he were still deciding how much to reveal even as he spoke. "I believe the old cellar beneath the west wing is where the exchange will happen tonight," he said. "It has an old tunnel entrance sealed decades ago after my grandfather's reign, one that few in this castle even remember exists. If Thornwood forces plan to slip men or goods into Blackthorn unnoticed, that tunnel would be the perfect route, and Julian would know of it from the old maps kept in the records room." Ilara felt a chill settle over her at the mention of a hidden entrance, something that had clearly existed unnoticed for years, right beneath everyone's feet. "How do you know about this tunnel if so few remember it?" she asked. "My father showed it to me as a boy," Damien said, a flicker of old memory crossing his expression. "He warned me it should remain sealed, a reminder of a darker chapter in Blackthorn's history. I never imagined I would need to think of it again, until tonight." Ilara considered the weight of what he was suggesting, and she understood before he even finished explaining that he wanted her near that cellar tonight, watching for exactly the kind of confirmation he needed before acting against his own beta commander. It felt like an impossible request, yet she also understood why he could not simply send a guard, someone whose absence from their normal post might raise suspicion long before any trap could be sprung. "If I am found near the cellar," she said carefully, "what excuse could explain my presence there at this hour?" Damien considered this a moment before answering. "The wine stores are kept in the adjoining chamber," he said. "Servants sometimes retrieve bottles for late gatherings among the household staff, a common enough excuse that would raise no alarm if you were questioned by anyone other than Julian himself. But if he sees you there, no excuse will satisfy him, given what you already know." "Then I will need to be careful that he does not see me at all," Ilara said, steadying herself with the resolve she had carried since the moment she first decided to seek him out earlier that night. Damien studied her closely, and something like genuine concern crossed his features despite the urgency of their circumstances. "You do not need to do this," he said quietly. "I could find another way, another set of eyes, even if it takes longer to arrange." "There is no time for another way," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. "You said yourself that tonight may be the only chance to catch him before Thornwood's plan succeeds. I already know the halls better than most guards who have only served here a fraction as long as I have. Let me do this." For a long moment, Damien said nothing, simply studying her, as though seeing something new in the maid, who had once been invisible to him among hundreds of servants moving through his castle. Finally he nodded, though the reluctance in his expression remained clear. "Stay far enough back that you can retreat instantly if anything goes wrong," he said. "I will position 2 of my most trusted guards near the upper cellar entrance, out of sight but close enough to respond the moment you signal danger. Do not attempt to confront anyone yourself. Your only task is to observe and report what you witness." Ilara nodded, memorizing every instruction carefully. "And the signal?" she asked. "How will I alert your men if something happens quickly?" Damien reached into a small pouch at his belt and withdrew a slender silver whistle, cool and smooth against her palm, as he pressed it into her hand. "One sharp note will bring them running immediately," he said. "Use it only if you are in genuine danger. Otherwise, remain silent and let events unfold as they will, until you can safely report back to me." She closed her fingers around the whistle, feeling its weight settle strangely against her palm, a small piece of metal now carrying the responsibility of her safety through whatever came next. "Thank you," she said quietly, though she was uncertain exactly what she was thanking him for, perhaps simply for trusting her with something this important, despite her low station in his household. "You are the one risking everything tonight," Damien said, his tone softer than she expected from a king renowned throughout the region for his fierce and unyielding reputation. "It is I who owes you thanks, not the other way around, and I intend to see that debt repaid properly once this is over." There was no time to dwell on his words, however, as a distant bell tolled softly somewhere in the castle, marking the hour drawing steadily closer to midnight. Damien's expression sharpened back into focus, the brief warmth between them giving way to the urgency of the task still ahead. "Go now," he said. "Move carefully, and remember everything you see. I will position my men and wait for your signal, or your safe return, whichever comes first." Elara nodded once more, and slipped away from the alcove, moving through the darkened corridors with a purpose that steadied her racing thoughts, despite the fear still coiled tightly in her chest. The castle felt different now than it ever had during her 3 years of quiet service. Every familiar hallway transformed into something charged with hidden danger, every shadow potentially concealing eyes she could not afford to be seen by. She made her way toward the west wing stairwell, descending carefully into the lower levels, where the air grew cooler and damper with each step, the scent of old stone and aging wine barrels growing stronger as she approached the cellar entrance. She paused at the top of the final stairwell, listening carefully for any sound of movement below, but heard only silence. Steadying her nerves, she descended the last few steps and slipped quietly into the shadows near the wine storage chamber, positioning herself where she could observe the adjoining cellar door without being visible from its threshold. The old wooden crates and dusty barrels around her provided ample cover, and she settled into a crouched position, prepared for what might be a long and tense wait until whatever was planned for tonight finally began to unfold. Minutes passed slowly, each one feeling like an hour, as she strained to hear any sound beyond the cellar door. She thought of Peter waiting anxiously in the kitchens, of Damien positioning his men somewhere above her in careful silence, and of Julian Ashford, a man she had trusted and respected for years, now potentially only moments away from revealing the true depth of his betrayal beneath the very castle he had sworn to protect. A soft creak echoed from somewhere further down the tunnel beyond the cellar door, followed by the faint scrape of a heavy stone being shifted aside. Elara's breath caught in her throat as she pressed herself further back into the shadows, watching as a sliver of pale moonlight suddenly appeared where solid stone had stood only moments before, revealing the long-forgotten tunnel entrance Damien had described, now opening slowly into the heart of his own castle. A figure emerged from the tunnel's darkness first, cloaked in gray fabric that blended almost perfectly with the shadows of the cellar, moving with the cautious confidence of someone well accustomed to slipping unnoticed through unfamiliar spaces. Behind him came a second figure, then a third, each carrying small crates that they set down carefully near the tunnel entrance, without a single word exchanged between them. Elara pressed her back harder against the cold stone wall, willing her breathing to stay slow and silent despite her hammering heart. She counted 5 figures in total emerging from the passage, their movements practiced and efficient, suggesting this was not their first time using this hidden route into the castle grounds. A moment later, familiar footsteps approached from the main cellar stairwell above, descending with measured confidence rather than the cautious secrecy of the cloaked strangers. Julian Ashford stepped into the dim lantern light carried by one of the newcomers, his expression composed in the same manner she had always known him to carry, though something about his posture tonight seemed different, sharper, more alert to his surroundings than usual. "You are later than we agreed," Julian said quietly, his voice carrying clearly enough now that Elara could make out every word from her hidden position among the wine barrels. "The Eastern Patrol took longer to clear than expected," one of the cloaked figures answered, his accent matching precisely the cold, clipped tone Elara had described to Damien earlier that night. "But we are here now, and the goods are secured. Your payment arrangement still holds?" "It holds," Julian confirmed, "though I must remind you again that this must be the final shipment through this passage. My king grows more watchful by the week, and I cannot guarantee this route remains undiscovered much longer." Elara's stomach twisted at hearing Julian speak so plainly of deceiving the king he had served for so many years, the casual confidence in his voice making the betrayal feel even more real than it had when she first overheard it through the tapestry hours earlier. She forced herself to remain perfectly still, memorizing every detail of the exchange for Damien to hear later. The cloaked leader chuckled softly, a sound with little warmth in it. "Your king suspects nothing of importance," he said dismissively. "He is too consumed with old treaties and outdated notions of honor to see the pieces already moving around him. By the time he understands what is happening, our position within these walls will be far too strong to dislodge." "And what of the timeline discussed previously?" Julian asked, his tone shifting slightly, businesslike rather than personal. "When do your commanders intend to move more openly?" "Soon," the cloaked man answered. Once we have secured enough influence among the border patrols and enough resources smuggled through this passage, the moment will present itself naturally. Perhaps during the harvest festival, when the castle's guard is thinned to accommodate visiting dignitaries and merchants from across the region. Alara felt her blood run cold at the mention of the harvest festival, an event only weeks away that drew visitors from across Blackthorn's territories, filling the castle with crowds and celebration. She realized with growing horror that whatever Thornwood was planning extended far beyond a single midnight shipment, reaching towards something much larger and more dangerous for the entire kingdom. "See that the payment reaches the usual location by week's end," Julian said, apparently satisfied with the answers given. "And ensure your men use greater caution moving through the eastern ridge. My warning to the patrol captain bought us time tonight, but that arrangement will not last indefinitely if suspicion grows among the king's other advisors." "It will be handled," the cloaked leader assured him, gesturing for his companions to begin moving the remaining crates further into the cellar, presumably towards some hidden storage space Alara could not see from her position. As the men worked, Julian stepped closer to examine one of the open crates, and for a brief moment, the lantern light illuminated his face clearly enough that Alara could see something troubling in his expression, not the cold satisfaction of a man committed fully to betrayal, but something closer to conflict, perhaps even regret, quickly masked behind his usual composed exterior. She wondered, watching him from the shadows, what could possibly drive a man who had served the king so faithfully for years toward a path this dangerous, this treacherous. But there was no time to dwell on such questions now. She had witnessed more than enough confirmation of the plot Damien needed, and every additional moment she lingered increased the risk of discovery. Carefully, she began shifting her weight, preparing to retreat quietly back up the stairwell the way she had come, intending to signal Damien's men waiting above, rather than risk using the whistle unnecessarily while things still appeared calm. But as she shifted her foot against the uneven stone floor, her boot caught the edge of a small wooden crate stacked slightly askew among the barrels, sending it tumbling to the ground with a clatter that echoed loudly through the cellar's stone chamber. Every conversation below stopped instantly. Alara froze, her heart lodged somewhere in her throat, as 5 sets of eyes and Julian Ashford's own sharp gaze turned immediately toward the shadows where she crouched, no longer hidden nearly well enough to escape notice. "Who is there?" Julian demanded, his voice carrying an authority Alara had rarely heard him use, stepping forward with a speed that left no doubt he intended to identify the intruder immediately. Alara's mind raced through every possible option, and she understood with sudden clarity that remaining silent and hoping to escape unnoticed was no longer a choice available to her. She reached for the silver whistle Damien had given her, her fingers trembling as she pressed it firmly between her lips, drawing the sharpest breath she could manage. The single note pierced through the cellar's silence, high and clear, cutting through the tension like a blade before Julian or any of the cloaked strangers could react. Somewhere above, she heard the immediate response, boots pounding against stone stairs, and she knew Damien's men were already rushing to answer her call. Julian's eyes locked onto the shadows where the whistle's sound had come from, and within seconds, he spotted Alara still crouched among the wine barrels, her identity no longer concealed by darkness. Recognition flickered across his face, followed swiftly by something colder, more calculating, as he understood immediately what her presence there meant for everything he had worked to keep hidden. "You," he said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge she had never heard from him before in 3 years of passing him politely in the castle halls. "How long have you been listening?" Alara scrambled backward, putting distance between herself and the Beta commander as he advanced toward her hiding place, his earlier composed demeanor completely replaced by something far more threatening. "Long enough," she managed to say, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the fear coursing through her entire body. The cloaked strangers behind Julian exchanged alarmed glances, clearly recognizing that their carefully planned operation had just been compromised in a way none of them had anticipated. Their leader barked a quick command in a language Alara did not recognize, and the men began hastily grabbing whatever crates they could carry, preparing to retreat back through the tunnel the way they had come. "This changes nothing," Julian said, though his voice betrayed a tension that contradicted his words, stepping closer still. "You will not leave this cellar to repeat what you have heard tonight." Before Alara could respond, the heavy cellar door at the top of the stairwell burst open with tremendous force, and Damien's voice rang out through the chamber, carrying an authority that froze every person present in place. Guards flooded down the stairs behind him, swords drawn and ready, their armor gleaming in the scattered lantern light. "Step away from her," Damien commanded, his golden eyes blazing with an intensity that made even the cloaked strangers hesitate, despite their obvious intent to flee. "Julian Ashford, you stand accused of treason against your king and your kingdom. Surrender now, and perhaps some measure of mercy remains possible." Julian turned slowly to face the king he had served for so many years, and for a moment, something like genuine anguish crossed his features, before hardening back into forced composure. "You do not understand what you are interfering with," Julian said. "Everything I have done, I did for reasons you refuse to see, blinded by outdated loyalty to a throne that has grown weak and complacent." "Then explain it to me," Damien said, his voice steady despite the visible tension in his shoulders, the pain of confronting a lifelong friend, clearly warring with his duty as king. "But you will explain it from a cell, not from the shadows of a hidden tunnel beneath my own castle." The Thornwood men, sensing the confrontation had turned decisively against them, began moving swiftly toward the tunnel entrance, abandoning their remaining crates in their haste to escape, before Damien's guards could block their retreat. Two of the king's men moved to intercept them, and a brief scuffle broke out near the tunnel mouth, shouts and the clatter of dropped equipment filling the cellar chamber. In the chaos, Julian seized the momentary distraction, lunging not toward escape himself but toward Alara, perhaps intending to use her as leverage against the king, who clearly valued her safety enough to have positioned guards specifically to protect her. Alara stumbled backward against the wine racks, her foot catching on an uneven stone, and she felt herself falling before she could catch her balance. Damien moved faster than she thought possible, crossing the distance between them in what felt like a single heartbeat, placing himself directly between Julian's advancing figure and her vulnerable position against the wine racks. The two men who had once trained together as boys now faced each other as king and traitor, the weight of years of friendship and trust hanging heavy in the tense silence between them. "Enough," Damien said, his voice low and dangerous now, carrying none of the earlier restraint he had shown while trying to reason with his former friend. "This ends now, Julian." Julian hesitated, clearly recognizing the futility of continuing his advance with the king himself, now standing directly in his path, surrounded by loyal guards who had already begun subduing the fleeing Thornwood men near the tunnel entrance. His shoulders slumped slightly, the fight visibly draining from his posture, as he accepted that whatever plan he had helped orchestrate had finally, irrevocably collapsed around him. Two guards moved forward at Damien's silent signal, securing Julian's arms firmly, despite his lack of further resistance, while others finished restraining the remaining Thornwood men, who had not managed to escape back through the tunnel before it was blocked. The chaos that had filled the cellar chamber, only moments before, began settling into the ordered aftermath of a plot successfully uncovered and contained. Damien turned immediately to check on Alara, who remained pressed against the wine racks, her breathing ragged but otherwise unharmed, despite the brief moment of danger. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice softening considerably from the commanding tone he had used moments earlier. "I am fine," she managed to say, though her legs still trembled beneath her, the adrenaline of the confrontation only now beginning to fade enough for the reality of what had just happened to settle fully into her thoughts. Around them, the guards worked efficiently to secure the remaining crates and prisoners, while Julian stood silently between his captors, his gaze fixed on some distant point rather than meeting the eyes of the king he had betrayed. The old tunnel entrance, once a forgotten secret buried beneath decades of dust and neglect, now stood exposed and guarded, its purpose finally revealed, after being used for reasons that threatened everything Blackthorn had stood for. "You did more tonight than I could have asked of anyone," Damien said quietly to Alara, once the immediate danger had fully passed, and his guards had begun leading Julian and the captured Thornwood men up the stairwell toward the castle's dungeons above. "Because of you, this threat has been stopped before it could grow into something far more devastating." Alara nodded, though exhaustion and lingering fear made it difficult to fully process the magnitude of what had just occurred. The plot she had accidentally uncovered, now fully exposed and contained, thanks to a chain of events that had begun with nothing more than a moment of overheard conversation behind an old tapestry. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the castle's highest towers, word had already begun spreading through Blackthorn's corridors that something extraordinary had happened during the night, though few servants understood the full truth of what had transpired in the cellar beneath the west wing. Whispers passed from kitchen to laundry room to stable yard, each version of the story growing stranger and more exaggerated than the last. Ilara had barely managed a few hours of restless sleep before Margaret Hale burst into the small chamber she shared with two other maids, her expression a mixture of confusion and barely contained curiosity. "Get up, girl," Margaret said, her earlier dismissiveness from the previous night completely forgotten. "The king has requested you appear before him again this morning, and half the castle is asking why." Ilara rose quickly, splashing cold water on her face from the basin near her cot, trying to steady herself for whatever came next. She had expected exhaustion to overwhelm her after the previous night's events, yet a strange, nervous energy kept her moving, despite how little rest she had managed to find. The corridors leading toward the great hall felt different in daylight than they had during the tense darkness of the night before, sunlight streaming through tall windows and illuminating dust motes drifting lazily through the air. Yet beneath the ordinary morning routine, Ilara sensed an undercurrent of tension throughout the household staff, guards standing more alert than usual, servants exchanging worried glances as they hurried through their duties. When she reached the great hall, she found it far more crowded than she expected. Several of the king's senior advisors gathered near the raised dais, where Damien typically held counsel, their expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed anger as they discussed something in hushed, urgent tones. Damien himself stood near the head of the group, still dressed in the same simple tunic from the previous night, clearly having not yet rested at all. He noticed her enter and gestured for her to approach, and the assembled advisors turned to study her with open curiosity, clearly having already heard some version of what had occurred, though perhaps not the full details only she and the king truly understood. "This is Ilara Voss," Damien announced to the gathered group, his voice carrying easily across the hall despite its size. Without her courage last night, Commander Ashford's betrayal would have continued undetected, and Thornwood's influence within these walls would have grown far beyond what we could have easily reversed. Murmurs rippled through the advisors at this announcement, several exchanging surprised glances at hearing a common maid credited so openly for uncovering such a significant threat. An older advisor with silver hair and sharp, assessing eyes stepped forward, studying Ilara with obvious skepticism, despite the king's clear endorsement. "Forgive my hesitation, Your Majesty," the advisor said carefully, "but a servant uncovering what our own intelligence network failed to detect for months seems remarkable indeed. How can we be certain this was not some elaborate deception designed to mislead us further?" Damien's expression sharpened at the implied doubt, though he answered calmly enough. "Because I witnessed the confrontation in that cellar myself, Councillor Bramwell," he said. "I heard Julian's own words confirming his arrangement with Thornwood forces. There is no deception here beyond the one Julian himself constructed against all of us." Bramwell inclined his head slightly, though his expression remained thoughtful rather than fully convinced. "Then perhaps it would be wise to question Commander Ashford directly," he suggested. "If his motives run deeper than simple bribery or coercion, we should understand the full scope of what we face before assuming this threat has been entirely contained." Damien nodded in agreement, and within the hour, Ilara found herself standing quietly near the entrance of the castle's interrogation chamber, having been asked by Damien to remain present in case Julian's account contradicted anything she had witnessed the previous night. The chamber itself was simple, a sturdy table and two chairs, far removed from the harsh dungeon cells where the captured Thornwood men had been placed instead. Julian sat across from Damien, his wrists bound but otherwise treated with more dignity than his crimes perhaps warranted, a decision Ilara suspected reflected the king's lingering difficulty in fully accepting the depth of his former friend's betrayal. Julian's earlier composure had returned somewhat, though shadows beneath his eyes revealed a night without sleep, much like everyone else involved in the previous evening's events. "Tell me why," Damien said simply, once the chamber door had closed behind them, leaving only the three of them present, along with a single silent guard stationed near the entrance. Julian was silent for a long moment before answering, his gaze fixed on the table between them rather than meeting the king's eyes directly. "You inherited everything, Damien," he said finally, his voice quiet but carrying an old, bitter weight behind it. "The throne, the loyalty of an entire kingdom, a birthright you never had to fight for beyond training exercises and ceremonial duels. I fought beside you in 3 wars, bled for this kingdom more times than I can count, yet remained only your beta, forever second, no matter how much I gave." Damien's expression tightened, though he remained silent, allowing Julian to continue. Thornwood offered something different, Julian went on. Not simply wealth, though that was part of it. They offered recognition. A place where my contributions would be seen as more than simply serving another man's inherited glory. I told myself I could manage both loyalties, that helping them gain a foothold here would never truly harm Blackthorn itself, only shift certain balances of power that had grown stagnant for decades. And the Harvest Festival, Damien said quietly, recalling the detail Alara had reported to him earlier that morning. Their true intention was never simply smuggling goods through that tunnel, was it? Julian's silence confirmed the answer, before he finally spoke it aloud. They intend to use the confusion of visiting dignitaries and thinned patrols to move a larger force into the castle grounds, he admitted. Something like genuine regret finally entering his voice for the first time since the confrontation began. I did not fully understand the scope of their ambition until recent weeks, and by then, I had already committed myself too deeply to withdraw, without risking exposure of everything I had already done. Alara listened from her position near the chamber's edge, watching the king absorb this confession, with a controlled stillness that nonetheless betrayed the deep personal pain beneath his composed exterior. Whatever history existed between these two men, forged through years of shared battles and boyhood friendship, was now being unraveled thread by thread in this quiet, somber chamber. You have given us enough to move forward, Damien said finally, rising from his chair with the weight of a decision clearly settling over him. Julian Ashford, you will remain confined until a full council can determine appropriate judgment for your crimes against this kingdom. Whatever mercy remains available to you will depend entirely on what further information you provide regarding Thornwood's full intentions toward the Harvest Festival. As guards led Julian from the chamber, Damien remained standing for a long moment, staring at the empty chair where his former friend had sat, before finally turning toward Alara with an expression that combined exhaustion, relief, and something else she could not quite identify. We have much still to prepare before the Harvest Festival arrives, he said quietly. But because of you, we now have the time to prepare properly, rather than walking blindly into whatever Thornwood intended. 3 days after Julian's capture, Alara found herself hurrying through the castle's eastern courtyard on an ordinary errand, carrying a basket of fresh linens toward the drying lines, when a sharp warning shout from one of the wall guards made her stop in her tracks. She turned instinctively toward the sound, and what she saw sent ice flooding through her veins. A figure in dark clothing had appeared near the courtyard's outer wall, moving with deliberate purpose directly toward her position, and something about his hurried, focused stride told her immediately that this was no ordinary visitor or castle servant. She recognized, with a jolt of terror, that this stranger's face bore the same cold, calculating expression she remembered from one of the cloaked men in the cellar that fateful night. Before she could fully process what was happening, the man closed the distance between them with alarming speed, reaching for something concealed beneath his cloak. Alara dropped her basket of linens and stumbled backward, her voice catching in her throat as she tried to call for help, the sound emerging only as a strangled gasp. Guards nearby had already noticed the commotion, however, several breaking into a run toward the courtyard the moment the alarm bell mounted near the gate began ringing furiously. The stranger hesitated only briefly upon seeing the swift response, clearly recognizing that his window of opportunity was closing rapidly, yet he pressed forward regardless, apparently determined to silence the one witness capable of testifying fully against Thornwood's conspiracy. Alara backed against the stone wall of the courtyard, her mind racing for any means of escape or defense, when a familiar powerful presence suddenly interposed itself between her and the approaching threat. Damien had emerged from the nearby training yard, drawn by the alarm bell, and upon seeing the danger facing Alara, moved with a speed that seemed almost impossible for someone his size. He caught the stranger's wrist, just as the man lunged forward, twisting the intruder's arm with practiced efficiency that spoke of years of combat training, forcing him to drop whatever weapon he had been reaching for onto the courtyard stones with a sharp clatter. The stranger struggled briefly against Damien's iron grip, but within moments, castle guards arrived to fully restrain him, securing his arms and hauling him upright despite his continued attempts to break free. Damien did not release his own grip until he was certain the man posed no further immediate threat, and only then did he turn fully toward Alara, his golden eyes searching her face and form for any sign of injury, with an intensity that made her breath catch, for reasons entirely separate from the fear she had just experienced. "Are you harmed?" he asked, his voice tight with barely controlled urgency, closing the remaining distance between them, until he stood directly before her. "I am unharmed," she managed to say, though her hands trembled visibly as she pressed them against the rough stone wall behind her, steadying herself against the lingering shock of how close danger had come to finding her in broad daylight, within the supposed safety of the castle's own walls. Damien's jaw tightened as he glanced back toward the restrained attacker, now being questioned roughly by the gathered guards near the courtyard gate. "Thornwood knows you were the one who exposed their operation," he said grimly. "They must have learned of your involvement through Julian's captured associates, or perhaps through someone else within these walls we have not yet identified." The realization settled heavily over Alara, that her role in uncovering the conspiracy had transformed her from an invisible servant into a marked target for enemies, who clearly possessed the reach and resources to send assassins directly into the castle grounds. The fear she felt now differed from anything she had experienced during that first tense night in the cellar. Less immediate, perhaps, but far more unsettling in its implications for her continued safety. "This cannot continue," Damien said, more to himself than to her, his expression darkening further as he considered the wider implications of what had just occurred. "If they are willing to risk sending someone directly into my courtyard in daylight, their desperation to silence you runs deeper than I initially believed." "What must I do now?" Alara asked, uncertain whether her ordinary life as a castle maid could ever fully return to normal after everything that had unfolded over these past few days. Damien studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his sharp gaze, as he seemed to reach a decision that had perhaps been forming in his thoughts even before this latest attack occurred. "You will no longer remain among the general household staff," he said finally. "Effective immediately, you will be moved to quarters within the castle's protected wing, under guard at all times until this threat from Thornwood has been fully neutralized." Alara opened her mouth to protest, uncertain how such a dramatic change would be perceived by the other servants, or whether she even wished for such a disruption to the quiet, invisible life she had maintained for 3 years within these walls. But Damien's expression left little room for argument. The same commanding certainty she had witnessed the night he first learned of Julian's betrayal, now fully directed toward ensuring her safety. "This is not a request," he said, though his tone softened slightly as he continued. "You saved this kingdom from a threat that could have devastated everything my family has built across generations. I will not allow that courage to cost you your life through my own negligence in protecting you properly." Alara nodded slowly, understanding that further argument would accomplish little against the king's evident determination. As guards escorted the restrained attacker away toward the dungeons to join Julian and the other captured Thornwood operatives, Damien remained beside her a moment longer, his expression carrying a weight of concern that seemed to extend beyond simple gratitude, or duty toward something Alara found herself unable to fully name, though she recognized its warmth settling strangely, comfortingly, within her own chest, despite the fear still lingering from the attack. "We will find whoever within these walls betrayed your location to them," he said quietly, his voice carrying a promise she had no doubt he intended to fulfill regardless of how long the investigation might take. "Until then, you remain under my direct protection, and I will not allow anyone to threaten you again." Trumpets sounded across Blackthorn's outer walls on the morning of the Harvest Festival, announcing the arrival of merchants, dignitaries, and travelers from across the kingdom's territories, their colorful wagons and banners filling the roads leading toward the castle grounds. Beneath the festive atmosphere, however, Alara knew the true tension gripping every guard and advisor within these walls, all of them aware that Thornwood's forces intended to use this exact day of celebration to slip their true intentions past the castle's defenses. She stood near one of the upper balconies overlooking the main courtyard, now transformed into a bustling marketplace filled with vendors and performers, her new quarters within the protected wing, offering a vantage point Damien had specifically chosen for her safety, while still allowing her to witness whatever unfolded below. 2 guards remained stationed discreetly nearby, their presence a constant reminder of the danger that still shadowed her since the attempted attack in the courtyard days earlier. Following Julian's continued cooperation during his confinement, Damien's advisors had spent the preceding days quietly repositioning guards throughout the castle grounds, disguising heightened security beneath the appearance of normal festival preparations. Additional soldiers had been brought in from surrounding garrisons, dressed as merchants and travelers themselves, blending seamlessly into the crowds, while remaining alert for any sign of Thornwood's promised infiltration. Ilara watched as Damien moved through the courtyard below, dressed in ceremonial attire, befitting the festival's opening, greeting visiting dignitaries with practiced grace that revealed nothing of the tension she knew he carried beneath his composed exterior. Councillor Bramwell walked close beside him, having become one of the king's most trusted advisors during this crisis, after his initial skepticism gave way to genuine respect for how thoroughly the threat had been investigated and addressed. A commotion near the western gate caught her attention sometime past midday, and she leaned forward against the balcony railing, watching as a group of merchants seeking entry were subjected to unusually thorough questioning by the guards stationed there. One of the disguised soldiers signaled subtly toward another, positioned near the main hall, and within moments, several additional guards converged discreetly around the group without alarming the surrounding festival crowds. She could not hear the exchange from her distance, but she watched as the merchant's wagon was searched carefully, revealing compartments beneath false floorboards that had clearly been designed to smuggle weapons or additional Thornwood operatives directly into the heart of the celebration. The merchants themselves, their disguise now uncovered, attempted to flee, but the surrounding guards moved swiftly to restrain them before they could disappear into the crowd. Ilara's heart pounded as she watched the scene unfold, understanding that this single group represented only one piece of whatever larger plan Thornwood had orchestrated for this day. She scanned the courtyard below with growing anxiety, searching for any other signs of the danger she knew still lurked somewhere within the festive chaos. Her attention was drawn suddenly to a familiar figure moving through the crowd, near the eastern stables, someone she recognized despite his attempt to blend in among the stable hands tending to visiting horses. It was one of the younger guards who had been present during Julian's initial capture in the cellar, someone Ilara had assumed was fully loyal to the king given his role in that confrontation. Yet something about his movements now seemed deliberately evasive, glancing repeatedly toward the castle's private wing entrance in a manner that struck her as far too calculated for an ordinary guard, simply going about his festival duties. She remembered suddenly a detail from her time serving in the household staff, a passing comment overheard weeks earlier, about this same guard requesting reassignment away from his usual post near the eastern ridge, the very route Thornwood's forces had used previously to smuggle goods into the castle. Without hesitation, she signaled one of her own stationed guards, quickly explaining what she had noticed, and urging him to relay the information to Damien immediately. The guard nodded and hurried away, disappearing into the crowd below, while Ilara continued watching the suspicious figure from her elevated vantage point, unwilling to lose sight of him, now that her suspicions had been raised. Minutes later, she watched Damien himself approach the area near the eastern stables, accompanied by several trusted soldiers moving with deliberate casualness to avoid alarming the surrounding festival crowd. The suspicious guard noticed their approach only when it was too late to flee unnoticed, and a brief, tense exchange occurred before he was quietly escorted away from the stables toward the castle's interior, his posture betraying the same defeated resignation Julian had shown during his own capture days earlier. By evening, as the festival celebrations continued largely undisturbed for the majority of visiting guests, unaware of the drama unfolding behind the scenes, Damien finally made his way to Ilara's quarters, exhaustion evident in his features despite the underlying relief she could also see reflected there. "Your instincts proved correct once again," he told her, settling into a chair near the small fire burning in her new chamber. "The guard you identified was indeed working with Thornwood, providing information about patrol schedules and security arrangements throughout these past weeks. Combined with the merchants we intercepted at the western gate, we have now dismantled every piece of their planned infiltration for today's festival." "Then it is truly over?" Ilara asked, allowing herself for the first time in days to consider that the danger threatening both the kingdom and her own safety might finally be approaching its end. Damien's expression grew thoughtful, weighing his words carefully before answering. "This particular plot has been stopped," he said. "Thornwood will likely retreat and reconsider their strategy after suffering such a significant setback. But threats like this rarely disappear entirely, and vigilance will remain necessary for as long as old grievances continue simmering beneath the surface of what appears to be peace." Ilara nodded, understanding the wisdom in his caution, even as relief washed through her at the immediate danger having passed. She studied Damien's tired features in the firelight, recognizing how much weight he carried as king, responsible not only for his own safety, but for every soul depending on his judgment and strength, to keep their homes and families protected from threats most of them would never even know existed. You have carried an enormous burden these past days, she said quietly, surprising herself with the gentleness in her own voice, as she addressed the man who ruled an entire kingdom with such fearsome authority in every other context. Damien looked up at her words, something shifting in his golden eyes that she had not seen there before, a vulnerability rarely permitted to surface beneath his usual commanding presence. So have you, he said quietly, more than anyone should have to carry, and yet you never once hesitated when it mattered most. The fire crackled softly between them in the comfortable silence that followed, both of them finally allowing themselves a rare moment of stillness, after days consumed by danger, suspicion, and the constant weight of protecting a kingdom from threats hidden within its own walls. Weeks passed following the harvest festival, and Blackthorn slowly settled back into its familiar rhythms, though nothing about the castle felt entirely the same as it had before that fateful night, when Alara first overheard a conversation never meant for her ears. Julian Ashford remained confined, his final judgment still pending before the full council, his cooperation regarding Thornwood's operations having earned him a measure of mercy that spared him the harshest punishment his crimes might otherwise have warranted. Ilara found herself summoned one morning to the Great Hall, where she had expected to find the usual gathering of advisors and petitioners seeking the king's attention on ordinary matters of governance. Instead, she discovered the hall nearly empty, save for Damien himself standing near the tall windows overlooking the castle grounds, sunlight streaming across his features as he turned to acknowledge her arrival. "You asked to see me, Your Majesty," she said, offering the customary bow she had performed countless times before during her years of quiet service, though something about performing it now felt strangely different given everything that had passed between them. Damien's expression carried a warmth she had grown increasingly familiar with over these recent weeks, replacing the guarded intensity that had once made approaching him feel like standing before an unpredictable storm. "I did," he said, gesturing for her to approach further into the hall, rather than remaining near the entrance, as protocol typically demanded. She crossed the polished stone floor toward him, uncertain what this summons might concern, though the empty hall and his evident calm suggested nothing urgent or dangerous awaited her this time. When she stood before him, he studied her for a long moment before speaking again, his voice carrying a seriousness that nonetheless lacked the grim weight of their previous conversations. "I have spent these past weeks considering how properly to repay the debt this kingdom owes you," he said. "No reward feels adequate against what you risked, first by coming forward with your warning, then by continuing to assist in uncovering the full depth of Thornwood's conspiracy, despite the danger it placed you in repeatedly." Ilara felt heat rise to her cheeks, uncertain how to respond to such open acknowledgement of everything that had transpired. "I only did what felt right," she said quietly. "I never expected reward for it." "That is precisely why you deserve one all the more," Damien replied, a faint smile touching his features, something rare enough that Ilara found herself momentarily transfixed by the sight of it. "I have decided, with the full council's agreement, to grant you a position within the royal household befitting your demonstrated courage and wisdom, no longer as a maid moving unnoticed through these halls, but as an advisor whose insight will be formally recognized and valued." Ilara's breath caught at the magnitude of what he was offering, a transformation so far removed from her previous life as a servant that she struggled momentarily to fully comprehend it. "Your Majesty," she began, uncertain how to properly respond to such an unprecedented offer. But Damien raised a hand gently, indicating he was not yet finished speaking, and something in his expression shifted further, the confident authority of a king giving way to something more personal, more uncertain than she had ever witnessed from him before. "There is something else," he continued, his voice quieter now, carrying a vulnerability that seemed strange coming from someone renowned throughout the region for his fearsome strength and unwavering command. "These past weeks, working alongside you through danger that would have broken lesser people, I have come to know something about you that goes beyond simple gratitude for your courage." Ilara's heart began to race, for reasons entirely separate from the shock of his earlier offer, watching as Damien stepped closer, his golden eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the vast hall around them seem to fade into insignificance. "I find myself unable to imagine returning to how things were before that night you first came to warn me," he said, "not simply because of the threat you helped me uncover, but because of who you proved yourself to be throughout every moment since. Your courage, your steadiness even in the face of genuine danger, the way you never once hesitated to do what was right, regardless of the risk to yourself. Your Majesty, Alara said softly, uncertain whether to hope for what she suspected he might be suggesting, given the impossible gulf that had always separated a king from a common maid within these walls. The Damien reached for her hand gently, his fingers warm against her own trembling ones, and the formality that had always existed between them seemed to dissolve entirely in that simple gesture. I am asking you to consider a place beside me, he said, his voice carrying none of the commanding authority she had grown accustomed to hearing from him, replaced instead by something achingly sincere. Not simply as an advisor to this kingdom, but as someone who has already proven herself capable of standing with me through whatever challenges may come, whether as friend, as partner, or perhaps, if you would have it, as something even more permanent between us. Alara felt tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, the weight of everything that had happened since that terrifying night, finally settling into something she could scarcely have imagined when she first crept through darkened corridors, carrying nothing but a warning and a trembling candle. I never imagined this, she admitted quietly. I only wanted to protect the kingdom that protected my family for so many years. And in doing so, Damien said gently, you have shown me exactly the kind of strength and integrity I have long hoped to find in someone I could trust completely, both as my king's advisor and, should you wish it, as something far closer to my heart. She looked up at him, this powerful alpha king who had once seemed so distant and untouchable to a lowly maid moving invisibly through his castle halls, now standing before her with genuine hope reflected clearly in his golden eyes, awaiting her answer with a patience she never expected from someone accustomed to absolute command over everything within his domain. Yes, she said finally, her voice steady, despite the overwhelming emotion coursing through her. I would be honored to stand beside you, in whatever way you would have me, for as long as you will have me there. The smile that spread across Damien's features then held none of the careful restraint she had grown accustomed to seeing from him, genuine and unguarded, in a way that transformed his entire presence. The fearsome Alpha King, momentarily giving way to simply a man who had found something he had perhaps not even realized he was searching for, until a maid's whispered warning changed the course of his life forever. Outside the tall windows of the great hall, Blackthorn's kingdom continued its steady rhythm of daily life, unaware of the quiet transformation occurring within its walls, where a king who ruled through strength and an unlikely maid who had once been invisible among hundreds now stood together, bound by courage, trust, and a warning whispered in the darkest hour of the night that had ultimately illuminated a path neither of them could have foreseen when it all began.